Recording in progress.
Hi, everyone. Welcome and thanks for joining us. Happy Sunday. Thanks for being here. Super Bowl Sunday at that. And today we're joined by our friend Edward from Georgetown University, who's going to continue his latest series of history programs that he's done. Edward has done a number of programs for us, and what I was going to do a little bit later, I'll post the links to the recordings of some of the ones he's done in the chat in Zoom. You can find them on our YouTube channel, which is Washington, D.C. History and Culture. If you can't remember that or don't know where that is, don't worry if you're watching live. What I'll do is I'll post the link to those in the chat a little bit later, and then I'll also email it out. I think, Edward, there's like, gosh, there must be like 10 or 12 programs you've done that are on our YouTube channel. So with that being said, let me turn things over to Edward, your host for the afternoon. And then if you have any questions, feel free to type those in the chat or the Q&A if you're watching live on Zoom, or in the comment section on Facebook if you're streaming us on Facebook. And Edward will try and answer as many of those as he can a little bit later in the program. Thanks, Edward. Take it away. It's all yours. And thanks for being here.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, DC Culture and History, for making this work possible. Thank you first, everyone, for being with us this afternoon. I hope this finds everyone safe and well. This is a friend of mine said, another one of Ed's happy history presentations. Actually, it's not. It's important work. Just as kind of as a background, I have been doing work on what I call enslavement, and I've touched on 9 or 10 different aspects of that. This is the follow-up of a program I did in November called The First Peoples of the Americas. So if you were with me in that one, some of this may be familiar, but most of this is going to center on California and the Southwest experience of First Peoples. I don't call them Indians. I try not to use the term Indigenous. I will call them First Peoples of America. Today is the mission, enslavement, AMDG. AMDG, for those of you who know your Catholic history, Ad Maiorem Dei Gloriam is a motto of the Society of Jesus. And I will say this in the outset, that the Society of Jesus, who participated in a number of the colonial Christian experiences with the French and with the Spanish in different places, have put up $100 million, basically, trust fund to help for the consequences of the enslavement that they did. Now, this is not Georgetown University, which was a different specific issue. This was the larger group of the Society of Jesus, and I want to commend them on that. And you see here an image from the mission, where the priest is leading the indigene out of the mission that has been basically terminated by Rome. In this case, because they said that it was clearly exploiting the people. Some of this is a review, not an unhappy review, but a review. To go back to November, I trust you will destroy their settlements and extirpate them from the country. Extirpate is not a word possibly we used in the 20th century so much. It was one that George Washington and others used. And this is Washington's letter to Major General Lafayette, 4th of July, 1779. As you can see, it's near the ending of the French and Spanish wars and the continuing conflicts over the boundary. And some of these boundaries that we see in the Declaration of Independence, when Jefferson talks about the merciless savages. Again, much of this is history that folks already know. George Washington had a measured relationship to the indigene. And in this particular case, you see he was on very sharp terms with them. They called him the town killer. So from Jamestown to George Washington, Richard Nixon, the final solution to the Indian problem. The Indian problem, of course, was the expression that was later picked up and modified by a different country in a different time zone in a different country. Language of the empire. And again, this is a bit of a repeat, these first slides from my November presentation. Okay. The only good Indian is a dead Indian. General Philip Sheridan, 1870 in Indian country. And Indian country, as you may recall, was actually the term given by the federal government to the lands serially bequeathed to the Indians, and which made them put them on reservations. And let me stop here and pause. That one of the reasons that we treat Indigenous First Peoples of America differently than Black Americans is this original notion that these were people themselves who already lived here, and we did some kind of trade and some kind of governmental work with them. Theodore Roosevelt, 1886. By the way, read his Settlement of the West, volumes 1 and 2. I don't go so far as to think that the only good Indians are the dead Indians, but I believe 9 out of every 10 are. From an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, recent by Roxanne Cruz. The settlers gave a name to the mutilated and bloody corpses they left in the wake of scalp hunts, Redskins. And aside, as a director of American Studies at Georgetown University, one of my graduate students was doing a documentary back in 2000 about that particular name of a particular team. Today, I can neither speak for the dead nor do justice to the First Peoples. I can, however, speak to the dead and to the functions these First Peoples serve still in the US political imaginary. This presentation might better be thought of as a consideration of the stories that we tell, the narratives, and tell in order to anchor an American fantasy called democracy and to assuage our guilt over the genocide called manifest destiny. The term genocide, by the way, is not mine. We will see where that comes from. So the questions that I'm asking, and one of my assignments for students to go to the National Gallery and to the American Wing and to view the art, what are Indians for? What is their place in the originary narrative? Originary narrative is the kind of like in the beginning, How I Met Your Mother, How I Met Your Father. It's the narratives that we confect about our past to collude with the present that we have. How has that narrative changed their history and presence in order to render us blameless? And my politic here, American slavery and enslavement wasn't the peculiar institution of the South alone. Just to point out that Wall Street and the stock market depended upon the Northern's investment and complicity in the enslavement. And in fact, it was New England who took the lead in the indigenous, I'll say it, slaughter and genocide from Massachusetts down through Connecticut. Here we will be talking about the West of slavery. And not only did the Southern dream of a transcontinental empire, the Confederacy and a couple of different places, not only was the war for Texas fought for that, but even before that, there were persons in the Southern states, General Walker, who tried doing what they would call vigilante moves into Mexico in order to extend enslaved states. So an overview, still repeating a little bit. From the earliest days of the United States, the federal government had not known what to do about the Indian tribes. And what they call the 8th to 31, the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, the Supreme Court, these are domestic dependent nations. And as nations, again, the difference between them and Black Americans, as nations, Indian tribes were not subject to the laws of states. They had agency and some sort of, however constrained, personal ability to negotiate for themselves. They were not property. They became property in some places, and we'll talk about that, but they themselves, in theory, were not. But the Constitution of the US did not provide any guidelines for dealing with another nation within the boundaries of the United States, and it was George Washington, under George Washington's presidency, that he federally reserved all of the dealings with exterior nations to the federal government. But so this also meant that Indians were not citizens of the United States, in the same situation that Black Americans between the 1857 Dred Scott's Supreme Court decision to 1870 and the end of the Civil War themselves had no access to law. And as part of the overview today, I consider in passing the first people of the Lower Americas. The Aztecs were pre-Columbian Mesoamerican people in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. They called themselves Mexica. The United States' obsession with the mythology of the West and this faux religious manifest destiny which basically was a way afterwards of apologizing and justifying the fact that we just took everything that we could find. Not only robbed indigenous people of their lands and homes, but also absolved itself of any ruin. And I want to just pause over here, and you can see even in a smaller version, the maps of the different linguistic groups of indigenous first persons. And this map here is simply in what we would call Northern America and does not yet include Mesoamerica. So the item, this is a quote, if we were to add up all of the Indian slaves taking in the New World from the time of Columbus to the end of the 19th century, the figure would run somewhere between 2.5 and 5 million enslaved. The point I want to make here also is that rarely does one see references to the enslavement of the indigene, although it was a full-time, especially in the New England provinces and states, it was an endless triangle from Rhode Island and Massachusetts and Connecticut to the Barbados and back. Our conception, and by the way, in Jamestown and Powhatan and Rebecca, whom we know as Pocahontas. Our conception of these first peoples was not one of enslavement, but of rivalry, a self-serving narrative of Americans, usually white Americans, as underdogs at great odds. Invasion is a structure, not an event. Canada, 50 nations, 50 indigenous languages, 1.7 million inhabitants. US federal recognizes 537 tribes, population current 7 million. Latin America, 800 different indigenous groups, 45 million population. The Other Slavery by Andre Resendez. Indigenous people, Professor Resendez says, were the original test subjects for enslavement. From 1493, when Columbus and everyone gets roused when you make noises about Columbus, but take a look at actually his own writings and what he said. Take a look at the contracts that he signed with Queen Isabella for the 10% commission he received on bringing enslaved persons back from the Barbados Islands back to the Spanish. Resendez explains that one of the reasons enslavement of indigenous people has been less understood is that it was illegal, according to the Crown, the Isabella Crown, so often operated in the shadows of the well-studied enslavement of African descent and African people in the Americas. By illegal, it is this. Queen Isabella, just to move forward very quickly, said to the Spanish conquistadors and to the always accompanying Franciscans who were with them, saying, these are your people, you have to take care of them. If you baptize them, they cannot be your enslaved persons. Okay, so flash forward in Virginia in 1860, and then 1760, the Virginia legislature passes a law that says that irrespective of whether a person is baptized or not, they will remain enslaved. So back from the early 1500s, this notion that making one a Christian forbid them from being enslaved, this has consequences, as we will see. So what's profound about Resendez's argument isn't that there was a kind of slavery older and more widespread than African slavery, or that it continued longer, although that's true. He writes, in 1865, 1866, Southern states enacted the infamous Black Codes aimed at restricting the freedom of former enslaved. Adopting tried and true tactics such as vagrancy laws, by the way, Martin Luther King in 1957 was arrested for that. Convict leasing and debt, white Southerners sought to nullify the provisions of the 13th Amendment, with the addition, I should say, of the Supreme Court, who invalidated the 13th Amendment on a state level. The tactics he listed were pulled from a playbook that kept Indians in servitude to the West and in Mexico long after enslavement had been made illegal. When we start talking about trauma and memory and representations of the past, there's clearly not one particular group that has precedence over this, that probably everybody in our hearing today has some history, either one of an enslavement in their family, in some kind of immigration situation, or simply even being Irish in this particular country, or Jewish, or Catholic. So all of us have a historical trauma, and it's what the United States in different places and different statutes and in different groups has not always been kind to its people. But looking at Mesoamerica in the 15th, 16th centuries, the world according to Europe, the Treaty of Tordesillas, the general New Spain history, Portuguese to Columbus, Mesoamerica and Mexico. We're going to touch on those 4 topics very quickly. What is useful to think about here is that one hears the argument, well, no, but there has always been slavery in the world, blah, 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 blah. And we do know this, and Guns, Bullets, and Diamonds by Jared Diamond, and other books will talk about how agriculture and its need for agricultural labor was probably the first major, and all of our protocols around enslavement come out of the Old Testament. You hear Christians talking about reading John's gospel. I no longer call you servants and masters. The word that he's translating servants is the Greek word doulou, which is enslave. So the King James in 1603 takes this particular Bible, he erases the Greek word enslaved and translates it servants. So when Jesus in John's gospel says, I no longer call you a master, I no longer call you servants, I call you friends. The language that we have, our Lord and Savior, our Master and Savior, put that into context. So enslavement has been part of the modern world in the Common Era, and even back to Aristotle and before that. But what will be new with Columbus and New Spain will be the beginning of race enslavement and its consolidation as a New World effect. What's interesting here on this particular map is you can see the distribution of indigenous peoples of the Americas. And there are lots and lots and lots of persons. This New World was not an empty world. Some significant dates, we've talked a little bit about 1493. We're going to spend a minute on each one of these. The 1521 invasion of Tecalitan by Hernan de Cortez, enslavement by Mexican Spanish. 1769, probably where we'll spend some time, the Spanish missions, and earlier in Florida. 1821, Mexican independence, and the immediate kind of contrast with the Confederate forces who moved into Texas to make a republic, to then turn this into a kind of enslavement sanctuary. 1848, discovery of white gold in California by the settlers, and the discovery of gold by white settlers. And 1848, 1374, US federal governance, which was one of the 3rd major and committed established forces to using extirpate from George Washington to extirpate the Native Indians. Why these dates are important, the run up to the Council in Valladolid, in the first discussion of race enslavement, and we'll talk about that. In 1503, when again, this is now 8 years after first contact with Columbus, the conquistador from Italy, who had gone in, not finding the gold that he was promised, not finding the land that he wanted, essentially filled 5 boats in the second trip back with the indigene. He called them the Indians, they were the Tano, actually. And he brought 300 to 500 back to Spain. And then his contract to return said that he would take 10% commission of the profit of these persons, who would then be distributed on an already existent Portuguese and Spanish history of enslavement, which was a variety of a way of, it could have been serfdom, but it was not the kind of race-based enslavement that was happening in the New World. But when the Queen Isabella in 1503 says that enslaving the indigenous was not legal because they were in fact becoming Christian, after the Spanish would have to find other workers for the sugar mills and the gold mills in the Caribbean. And at this particular place, they began to look to Africa. But even without legal warrant, the Spanish never ceased enslaving the indigenous people. So Nueva España, 1492, Columbus and the Spanish throne a will to enslave. This is a commercial enterprise for the Spanish. 1519, 1521, Hernan Cortez and the attack on the Mexico with biological weapons, disease, and mounted from Cuba. 1521, 3 years, the fall of Tenochtitlan. 1526, San Miguel de Guadalupe. This is the first Spanish mission on the coast of Georgia, what would be the Carolina provinces, and probably the first place, again, after the Queen's edict against enslaving indigenous, that the Spanish conquistadors bring incarcerated Africans into the mix. So there were 100 Black slaves brought from Africa to Mission San Miguel de Guadalupe. After a year, they had disappeared. So these were really the earliest Black enslaved persons in the continental US. 1565, the Presidio at St. Augustine, which later becomes a US colony. 1768, the first mission in San Diego. 1821, Mexican independence. Back again to early Spain. The Spanish Empire would expand across the Caribbean islands, and you can see in the blue how much of this was taken over in terms of span. When you see a lot of this particular area up here, all of this is going to go to the US and to Britain, and they'll be kept with that. The Treaty of Tordesillas, agreement between Spain and Portugal negotiated by the papacy. We should come back over here that the Portuguese explorers in about 1444 were the first merchants seeking money off the coast of what we now call Ghana in northern Africa. Now, Africa was the colonialist term for this. If you asked a current resident of the country where they lived, they would likely not say Africa. They would say Ghana or Namibia or whatever their country is. So I use Africa with a kind of edge there. But in 1444, the Portuguese were the first to take from already enslaved persons in these countries and sell them to other places. So the Portuguese became a kind of an Uber, if you want, for taking enslaved persons around and selling them to different countries. So that as Portugal first made its way down to what we now call South America, and the effects of enslavement there still went on much later than they did in North America, and we don't really much talk about it. I talk a bit about it here. But with agency from the Catholic Church, in this particular treaty, the Pope Alexander said, on this side of the line is Spain, on this side of the line is Portugal. And now notice, these are modern images. These are of the continents, not what would have been known in 14 or 1500 maps. Okay. What follows are a few images by a local Franciscan bishop who was there, and some of them are not most of them are not pleasant. But landing first on the Caribbean island of Hispaniola, 1492, and beginning explanation and exploration of the island of Cuba. From the indigenous people there, Columbus learns of an island just south, filled with gold, called Jamaica, now known as Jamaica, 1494 landing. The point here is that the British will take over Jamaica in about 1615. William Penn, the father of the Penn, who settled Pennsylvania and was an abolitionist. So there you have that family line. But so here you have the bishop's drawings of what the Spanish conquistadors were doing to the natives. You see on the left, arms are being cut off, and this is a trade practice that was continued by the Belgian nation in the scramble for Africa in as late as the turn of the century, where if you didn't bring the colonists the gold and what they wanted at the cotton, this is what they did. And you can Google these images of colonialists in Africa with children whose arms have been cut off like this. So this is not a new thing here. The varied indigenous people decimated on Hispaniola, now Haiti and the Dominican Republic, beginning under Columbus, were not Indians, but Tainos. Within 60 years after Columbus landed, only a few hundred of what may have been 250,000 Taino remained. On the left side, you see how dogs have been turned loose on the inhabitants. Bartholomew de las Casas, he was at first a conquistador, then he became a Franciscan, and later he became a bishop. And what we know of this, what he calls brutal sport, comes from a destruction of the Indians written in 1539, which he takes back to Spain and presents to the administrations and to the king and queen. He describes Spanish settlers competing to see if they could cut off a Taino's head in one stroke, often hunted the Tainos with dogs, allowed their dogs to tear the victims apart. It's an inflammatory headline, but one can understand that when one starts to think about it, and everyone will say, well, no, but he discovered a new world. We do need to rethink how what we do with a lot of our colonial history. And the fact that very often it's not taught as colonial is itself part of the problem. But Columbus lands 1493, a mere 6 months after Alexander VI's papal decree inter cetera, which essentially gave Portugal and Spain permission to basically inflict Christianity on the barbarians. And within a generation of Columbus landing, perhaps only 5 to 10% of the entire island remained. Columbus' son, Hernando or Fernando, as different texts have it, he writes in a review of it, in a biography of his father, he writes that many of these red men, women, and children were, quote, roasted on spits, and the invaders hacked the children into pieces. Columbus men would, quote, make bets as to who would slit a man in two or cut off his head in one blow. In one specific incident, a Columbus underling, quote, suddenly drew his sword, then the whole 100 drew theirs and began to rip open the bellies to cut and kill a group of Tainos assembled for this purpose. And these victims included men, women, children, and old folks. A Spanish historian and a Catholic Franciscan, Bartolomeo de las Casas, who witnessed much of the carnage, said Columbus ordered his men to cut off the legs of children who ran from them in order to test the sharpness of their blades. Okay, I'm not going to read more of that. You kind of get the point. And by the way, any of these references one can have, all one needs to do is go to the internet and you can find much of this now. You may have to do some digging, but Bernard de las Casas was one of the few people to take a stand in the Caribbean. And by the way, there's a cognate between the Caribbean and cannibal and the island that we talk about in The Tempest. All of this circulates in a stew of European voyeurism and how do we say it politely, eroticism and fear of these particular groups of people. In 1492, Columbus makes his own intentions clear. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. As soon as I arrived in the Indies, on the first island which I found, I took some of the natives by force in order that they might learn and might give me information of whatever gold there is in these parts. Let us, in the name of the Holy Trinity, go on sending all the slaves that can be sold. There's no way around to disengage Christianity from its colonial enterprise and back to Spain's and AMDG, all for the greater glory of God. That while the Franciscans and the Jesuits, their duty was to convert and to take care of the people, they were functioning as an arm of the government whose point was exploration and empire. The other slavery was said. He asserts that through death, although disease was a factor, the indigenous population of Hispaniola would have rebounded the same way Europeans did following the Black Death, if it were not for the constant enslavement they were subject to, because Columbus and the Spanish were still trying to find, the Isle of Gold, the town of gold, the city of gold. They were looking for this in Florida later. He says, quote, that among these human factors, enslavement was the major killer of Hispaniola's population, and that, quote, between 1492 and 1550, a nexus of slavery, overwork, and famine killed more natives in the Caribbean than smallpox, influenza, or malaria. By 1521, the islands of the Northern Caribbean were largely depopulated, and it gives no accident then that by 1521, Cortez arrives in Mexico. Although they're not precise numbers, the city's population has been estimated at between 200 and 400,000. At this particular time, London, just for population comparison, had 40,000 people. This places Tenochtitlan among the largest cities of the world at the time. The conquest of the Aztec Empire, also known as the Conquest of Mexico, took 2 years, largely because they collaborated with, use that word, with other indigenous persons in the area who had tired of the Aztecian or Mexica of its ability to hold them on the subjugation. And in 1524, the Royal Iron, which was like the Duke of York's tattoo brand on the enslaved persons in New York, the Royal Iron arrives in New Spain, sent by the King of Spain to mark a leg, buttock, arm, face, the Indian enslaved, known as ransom iron. Subsequently, enslaved indigenous people were given to government officials in various missions. So when, I think we'll go backwards. This is a detail from a 1951 mural by Diego Rivera in the National Palace, Mexico City, which depicts Spanish enslavement in Mexico. And this is a fairly standard picture because what the point was the monks would baptize them and then they would be used as labor. I'll make a point later that this is the mission system is the plantation system, or the encomienda system of, or serfdom actually, of labor, that it does not differ in practical expenses from what we know as a plantation system. 1531, this codex, a legal document entered into a case against the colonial government of New Spain, showing that 8 men and 12 women were given to the Spanish in tribute, along with dry goods and other materials. There's the Queen. The European Empire of Blood. I rarely use the word transatlantic slavery because it accentuates and goes away from any kind of blame to the empires who caused it. France, Spain, Portugal, Brussels, Denmark, in some cases Norway, and then in later years, the United States. But by 1800, you can see that the colonial area was more than twice the size of the United States. It was ruled by a viceroy from Mexico City who governed on behalf of the King of Spain. As we will begin to see, this whole area here, which at this particular time is France, okay? Jefferson, president, as well as a colonialist in Virginia, is looking for this place here, this particular patch called Louisiana because of New Orleans. So when this French offered to sell Jefferson or the United States, what we call the Louisiana Purchase, Jefferson, without any backing from Congress, actually does this illegally. And the point being, I guess, in case you've heard me other places, that he was very eager because the enslavement economy needed expansion west, so that in 1848, the expression manifest destiny was usually being run by the Spanish forces, not Spanish, the colonial forces who wanted places to safely practice enslavement. And again, that points out that on a number of different occasions, there were attempts from different Confederate or Southern states to enter into some kind of conflict here and take over places, so that in the military, you know, from the halls of Tripoli, from the halls of Montezuma to Tripoli, that the setup of the Mexican U.S. war was largely about enslavement. Different pause. Latin America, 800 indigenous groups, 45 particular million population. Okay. In Latin America, we're not going to spend much time actually in this particular one slide, but thousands of indigenous people forced to work at these particular mines. And Potosi in Bolivia stands on a barren terrace, and the foundation of the city dates from 1547, 2 years after the discovery of silver. It's estimated that as many as 8 million Andean Indians died because of the mining here. And the effects of enslavement in Latin America and Brazil are still, to some extent, much more evident and much worse, and were not even addressed until much later than the Western US, London, and so the colonial slavers. To pick up a point I made earlier, an unexpected response to Spanish practices of cruelty shared by other colonizers leads to the enslavement of African indigenous people. Why is this and how is this? Following the indigenous Taínos' nearest decimation from forced labor, thank you, Columbus, disease and war, the Spanish, under advisement of the Catholic priest Bartolomeu de las Casas, and with the blessing of the Catholic Church, began engaging in earnest in the kidnapped and forced labor of enslaved Africans. The law says you cannot use the indigenous persons who are your, I don't know what they would call them, but who are persons in your missions who are Christians, they cannot be enslaved. You have to find your labor elsewhere. But the problem with this, or not the problem with this, but this then became complicated, that anybody who was not a Christian, and well, you had the British and you had the Portuguese who were transporting already transporting Africans. And during the French colonial period, 1625 on, the economy of Haiti, Saint-Domingue, was based on slavery, and the practice there was regarded as the most brutal in the world. The book we referred to earlier, here you see an image of the cover. The Latin cover is translated up on the left. The most thorough narration of the Indian lands depopulated by the Spanish, first by Bishop Bartolomeu Casasius. The Valladolid debate, 1550 to 1551, was the first moral debate in European history to think about colonialism, new and old worlds, and the treatment of indigenous persons by conquerors. And this is very different, as I said, from the kind of enslavement that went on in the serfdom, which that was current and all the way even before through the 1348 and the Black Plague in Europe, and how that ended that. But they would have seen this as something very different than that. It was a moral and theological debate about the conquest of the Americas specifically, and its justification for the conversion to Catholicism specifically, and more specifically about the relations between the European settlers and the natives of the New World. Remember that most of the colonial persons in what we call the upper US or upper colonies were Protestants, Protestant Christians, and French and Spanish, and most of the European countries would have been Catholic. For the first time, this is a quote, "For the first time, and probably for the last, a colonizing nation organized a formal inquiry into the justice of the methods used to extend its empire. For the first time, too, in the modern world, we see an attempt to stigmatize an entire race as inferior, as born slaves, according to the theory elaborated centuries before by Aristotle." Who do we know who will pick this up? Our friend Thomas Jefferson in Notes on Virginia, of course. And Thomas Jefferson really would have been a spokesman. And so in the 19th century, anything that Jefferson said about any of this was taken as a law, and he became kind of the head theoretician for polygenesis, which was the excuse used for why we needed to take care of enslaved persons. So moving more directly now to Nuevo Mexico, the Southwest Baja California. Slavery in colonial or Spanish California, and later federal US oversight, by oversight in the sense of that, from the first days of the gold rush and settlers into California through 1874, the United States federal government authorized and helped and dispensed both monies and laws to help eliminate indigenous persons in the states. There are books here that you'll see if you are interested in following this. The systemic enslavement of indigenous Californians. They introduced chattel slavery and involuntary servitude in the area. And in many particular places, as Resendez points out, because the laws were written differently about enslaving Black people, the indigenous persons would get away with a different kind of, and you'll see in Los Angeles, there was actually a slave jail. They would give the enslaved persons a couple bottles of liquor. They would get out, they would do some work, they would drink the liquor, they would be picked up again, brought back to jail, and part of their punishment they would be. So it was a different kind of convict leasing. But in 1769, and the reason that this is important is that this is after Mexico had declared its independence from Spain and secularized the missions. I'm sorry, this one is before that though. In 1769, founds the first Spanish mission, Mission San Diego de Alcala. They established 4 military installations through California, including Presidio Real San Diego, Presidio Real San Francisco, Presidio Real Santa Barbara. If you're a Californian, you know the El Camino Real, which goes from way down south to way up north. The important date to think about is the 1769 date. Again, remember what's happening on the East Coast. Most of Spain's holdings on the East Coast, including Florida and upper parts of the Canadian Great Lakes, are ceded over to the US at the Paris Treaty, which ends the war between Paris and France, what they call the Spanish and Indian War. So much of the Spanish area is ceded to Britain, which is the first time that we get a lot of this particular land, including Africa, actually, including Augustine and Florida. June 12, 1679, Charles II issues a general declaration freeing all indigenous slaves in Spanish America. In 1680, this was included in the Leyes des Indians, a codification of the laws of Spanish America. And this is the back narrative for what would become the mission system. Because since the indigenous could no longer be enslaved, they had to find some kind of method to move them into a position where they could then be used in terms of their labor. Cabrillo claims California for Spain in 1542, but Spain doesn't attempt to occupy the land until the late 1700s. This is Santa Stefan del Rey, the Acome Pueblo. You can see an image along one side of the wall, but you can't see it here so much, which is a fire and brimstone, to use that expression. And the Indian guide, when we were there in Acoma, I asked her, what does the image represent? And she says, these are the Spanish burning in hell for what they have done to my people. So missionization, the act of converting Native Americans through cultural and religious instruction, became central to the Spanish colonial strategy if we could not, in that particular case, enslave them. So the encomienda system and the plantation economy, we don't ever think about the missions as plantations. That's what they were. And as other European colonial powers joined the Spanish, the practice of indigenous enslavement was expanded. The new international market for staple products like tobacco and sugar and raw materials. And here I'm going to pause to say that 60% of American shipping out of Rhode Island until the 1840s was to the Caribbean islands, taking tobacco and sugar and raw materials and liquor, and continuing the loop over to London and then back up to Rhode Island and Massachusetts. Faneuil Hall, as you know, in Boston, was one of the very earliest philanthropists from Boston to engage in the enslaved trade. So incentivize a creation of extraction and plantation-based economies in colonies such as English Carolinas, the Spanish Floridas, and French Louisiana, which is what Jefferson wanted. By 1499, Spanish settlers on Hispaniola had discovered gold in the Cordillera Center, not much, but it created a demand. And so this is where an estimated 400,000 Taino people across the islands were soon enslaved to work in gold mines. By 1519, again, to go back up earlier, they had exhausted this and exhausted the people. And so then they began the movement into Mexico proper and then upwards up the coasts. The practice of enslaving natives was immediately but ineffectively opposed by the Spanish cause we have talked about. Here are some of the books that you're looking at. Some of the studies: An American Genocide, the United States and the California Indian Catastrophe. Catastrophe is his word, as you use. We're going to look at the titles of the books here in a bit. A Cross of Thorns, the Enslavement of California's Indians by the Spanish Missions. The Missions of California, the Legacy of Genocide. And by the way, it might be a moment to go back and to review and to see again the film of the Mission, where the cardinal from Rome basically comes in and closes it down as saying, we are doing these, we should never have been here to begin with. with these people. The missions in the Southeast connection builds on Spanish events in early Florida and the Gulf Coast. After 1769, the life of the California natives who came in contact with the Spanish was reshaped by the mission fathers, not the townspeople of the pueblos or the soldiers of the presidios. So there was a different kind of what I would call soft power. You didn't have militarization, but they became kind of basically family workers. The Franciscans came to California not merely to convert the tribes, but to train them for life in a European colonial society. Conversion was seldom entirely voluntary, and converts or neophytes were not left to return to their own ways, required to live in the walled mission enclosure or rancherias, separate settlements sponsored by missions located some distance from mission proper. Back to a point I mentioned earlier, before 1619, there was 1526. This is a Washington Post headline. Mystery of the first enslaved Africans in what became the United States. This is the country that we would now know as Georgia and the Carolinas. And this was a 1526. The date is important because, again, the Spanish conquistadors are now under law that they cannot enslave the inhabitants, what they would call Indians, and they had to find labor in other kinds of places. So they're beginning to find now, they're beginning to pick up from Portugal and the British and the enslavement trade of Blacks. This is, again, California tribal groups. Spanish incursions into Baja follows the retreat from the eastern portions of the contested American continent. We really connect what's happening in California to what was happening and what happened in Florida with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. California has the largest population of Native Americans out of any state, 723,000 currently identifying an American Indian or Alaskan Native tribe as a component of their race, 14%. And according to the National Conference of State Legislatures, there are currently over 100 federally recognized Native groups or tribes in California, including those spread to several states. And what one will see here by the time we get to 1848 and the gold rush in 1874, the early fiction that these persons had some kind of legal autonomy and agency to form their own nations, that was long gone by the way. In other words, now they were any way that you could eliminate these particular persons, including enslavement, you were given permission to do that. And the law helped, and the law provided money for it. The padres would often baptize Native Californian villages en masse, relocate them to the missions. The image I used before of two indigene racing across, that's what this was. They would baptize Native Californian villages en masse, thus using the law, and then relocate them, thus giving credence to the law, taking care of them, relocate them to the missions where they would then work either voluntarily or by force. To the padres, the Native Californians were newly baptized members of the Catholic Church, were treated with varying amounts of respect depending on the priest in question. Think about Valladolid again. These are folks, think about polygenesis, think about the difference in race, think about 1557 and Linnaeus's issue of the four different racial colors and how the hierarchy of these. Think about 1795 and Blumenbach's Caucasian and how the Caucasus had the most full representation of human beings. 1782, Jefferson's Notes on Virginia, that there was a reason that these were human beings, but they were lesser human beings and needed to be taken care of in ways, and only the white peoples could do that. They would not have said white people, they would have said European Christian. Many of the soldiers, however, saw them solely as manpower to be exploited. And the settlers, the colonial settlers in California were not the only people to see the benefits in gold. So, I mean, that particular mining had happened and happening. You will see in 1850, the beginning of the photographs, you will see early images of enslaved persons, Black Americans, and I call them Black Americans because they are at this time, they're born here They're not imported or hijacked or, and that kind of that funny word diaspora. They had no agency over this. They were born in this particular country. There were multiple recorded uprisings by the Native Californians, violent and nonviolent. And prior to the California missions, again, prior to 1769, there were about 300,000 Native Californians. And by 1834, scholars believe that only 20,000 remained. Most scholars are in agreement. This is a kind of a parents. Most scholars are in agreement that 90% of indigenous first peoples in the native first peoples of the upper colonies and this particular area were exterminated. This is one of Resendez's points. Were exterminated by enslavement, loss of homeland, loss of changing foods. One tends to hear that they were killed off by disease. And Resendez is to the point, and I would agree with him, that simply tends to exculpate the agency of the persons who slaughtered and killed the people. Spanish began settling in California in 1769, ceding the Eastern America's footprint in the British. Come down to here. September 2015, Juniper Rosero was a brutal colonialist. So why did Pope Francis just make him a saint? I don't particularly have a reason for this. This was a headline out of the Los Angeles Times. And if you are California, you will recognize lots of these images. If you're a Californian, you'll recognize along 280, Juniper Rosero Highway. Okay. And I put these elements in here to underscore that while we hear a lot about Black Lives Matter and justice for enslaved persons, and rightly so, the narrative that is often eliminated, forgotten, not mentioned, not talked about, not even considered, is this particular one. And how are the indigenous persons? If one goes to California, the missions are a tourist place. You would not be going someplace and touring, likely touring the plantations as an uplift. So here you have an Archbishop of San Francisco in 2015 performing exorcisms at the destruction site of Saint Juniper Rosero statue. He said it was the devil that was making them do it. There's only a couple images here of this, but it's a fascinating awakening, if you want, not even awakening, because I've been doing this for years in California, but the understanding and the notion that the Christian colonization of California, while it might make for an interesting movies and tourism, has deeper roots to be considered. So Serra's mission destroyed entire native cultures, and now he's going to be a saint. This is another headline. He founds the first mission in 1769 in San Diego, and then there were 21 missions again later. And you see the standard image is that they're baptized and then they're put to work. And what they don't show you in the missions very often is that the pole, the flogging pole and platform in the center of the platform, in the center of the mesa. And come here to the red. The U.S. occupation of California and its settlement exterminated more than 100,000 California Native persons in 25 years, 1848 through 1870, reducing the population to 30,000 by 1870. This was begun, though, by, as we've been talking about here, by Juniper Rosero and these early particular missions. This was a commentary by one of the Franciscans. They were all bound with rawhide ropes. Some were bleeding from wounds. Some children were tied to their mothers. The next day, we saw some terrible thing. Some of the runaway men were tied to sticks and beaten with straps. One chief was taken out to the open field, and a young calf, which had just died, was skinned, and the chief was sewed into the skin while it was yet warm. He was kept tied to a stake all day, but he died soon, and they kept the corpse tied up. Now, if one's familiar with Edward Tudor and King Henry VIII, putting someone's head on a pole and keeping someone's body out as a public spectacle, this is not simply limited to one group of people. Mexican enslavement, 1821 through 1846. Mexico gets its independence from Spain, and so then for the next 20 years, it has the secularization of the missions. By 1846, Mexican government had made the mistake of inviting US settlers into the area that we would now call Tejana over Texas as a way of adding population. By 1846, these settlers who wanted this land for this Declaration of Independence in 1836. Americans wanted Texas to be part of the US. This is the land. The Mexican cession by the settlement of the US, James Polk, who wanted an extension of US enslavement, he was a slaveholder himself in the White House, went to war with Mexico, and Mexico was not prepared for this. And essentially, we ceded about 50% of its land to the US. Back up to here. Largely fought about extension of slavery, and the same thing that Jefferson was doing with the Louisiana Purchase. It's fascinating history to read the incursions into Mexico through various states. I won't call them confederacies, but from the 1850s through the 1860s, the term is called filibuster. This is not a speech. A filibuster was like a conquistador. It was a soldier who was essentially an opportunist, a mercantile who was going in for glory and whatever money he could get out of it. But the various incursions into, just like there were incursions in 4 different times into Canada to try to make Canada part of us. US officials, even as the controversy of the expansion of enslavement to the West raged elsewhere in the United States, US officials laid the groundwork, quote, to maintain existing systems of Indian servitude without overtly legalizing slavery. If one has the need to have some accurate history, this is the book that I would turn you to. And this is specifically now, not the Spanish, not the missions, but this is something, this is us, this is the United States and the California Indian catastrophe. 1846, 1873, again, the dates, the Republic of Tejana through 1873, the last formal rules, federal government around the Indian country. But once the United States assumed control of California, the population decline continued to increase. The author cites census details showing that the native population fell from 150,000 in 1846 to barely 16,000 by 1880 as a result of federal law, federal exploitation of countries and of persons, money put behind that. The decline was not the result of an uncontrollable demographic disaster, the consequence of an organized destruction of California's Indian population under US rule. Interesting to see all these folks. Lincoln is possibly the only one who didn't have something negative to say about the indigenous first Americans, although he was the one who in the 1862 Homestead Act simply basically gave away the Indian country of Oklahoma. Go figure. Throughout the book's 8 chapters, Madeline explores 4 categories of the killings that together made up the genocide of California's native populations: battles, massacres, homicides, executions. All of these occurred over the first 30 years of US control because there was a, quote, sustained political will called manifest destiny to enact and carry out policies and procedures that supported these actions. You saw Philip Sheridan, The Only Good Indian is Dead Indian. You see Theodore Roosevelt in his 2-volume, How the West Was Won, Volume 1 and Volume 2. 9 out of 10 Indians, they only did, how does he frame it? 9 out of 10 Indians are dead, the other one should be. A quote in 1866, he predicts the total extermination of the Digger Indians of California and the tribes of the other states within 10 years. Concludes by strongly urging the establishment of a protective Aborigines society, something similar to the society in England to prevent cruelty to animals. You can see the link there between the 4-footed animals and the 2-footed animals, is that there's a gradation on how human is understood. But this means he thought that the condition of the Indian might be improved upon and the race longer perpetuated. The titles alone of this book are revealing, and I pardon for spending some time on it, but it's probably the best single source of US involvement So when Dr. Martin Luther King in 1863 says ours was probably the only nation that sets out on this kind of genocide, which is his quote, we may not have been the only nation doing it, but in 1863, nobody else was talking like this. First chapter is California Indians between 1846, we talked a little bit about that. The prelude to genocide, 1846 to 1848, the onrush of the gold settlements. Gold, immigrants, and killers from Oregon, 1848, 1850. The killing campaigns of December 1849, 1850. Legislating exclusion and vulnerability. Virginia does the same sort of thing. If you go to this particular date, after 1903, if you were an indigenous person in Virginia, if you're any person in Virginia, you had to have a certificate stating your color. And if you were an indigenous person, they didn't have a category for that, so you would have been black or colored. Rise of the killing machine, militias and vigilantes, 50 through 54. Perfecting the killing machine, December 1854 through 1861, and the Civil War in California and its aftermath. The gold rush marks the beginning of what modern historians rightly regard as genocide of California Indians, in which the indigenous population plummets from about 150,000 in the late 1840s to 30,000 roughly 2 days later. The LA Times, 2016. It's time to acknowledge the genocide of California's Indians. Governor Gavin Newsom acknowledges and apologizes for the genocide against California Indians. Specifically, he states, it's called a genocide. That's what it was, a genocide. There's no other way to describe it. His point there being that there's all kinds of, well, no, but it was this, or it was that, it was disease, or was, and he said, no, this is what it was. There's no other way to describe it, and that's what it needs to be described in the history books. And so I'm here to say the following. I'm sorry on behalf of the state of California. An aside, we probably all here know that under his rule and direction, California is now the first state to think about states' reparations for Black Americans. This has been a very quick and spotty walkthrough of a variety of 3 different times: Spanish colonialism, Mexican colonialism, and then US. This last portion that I want to speak about here a little bit is what we call, the federal government calls, Indian country. The uses of a political fantasy narrative, and a little talk about settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is when persons come into a land intending to stay there. It's an empire motivation and protocol. It's not just we are sending tobacco and cotton back to whatever place we're sending it back to, but it is our job here to exterminate and eliminate, as George Washington said, extirpate these persons who are on our particular land. I'm going to come back now to the Declaration of Independence. If you go back and you can read this, and he talks about, Jefferson says, for King George has stirred up the merciless Indian savages on our boundaries. A little bit of history here on the royal policy of 1873, where King George establishes this is the colonies over here on this side of the Appalachian. This is Indian country and Indian land. None of the colonial settlers can enter it. This was largely a response to, and this is what I think began to cause the Revolutionary War thunder, along with the rulings in London at the time that said enslavement in London, there was nothing in common law for it. So suddenly the colonies began to see that in a couple different ways, they were not going to, one, get the land that they want or the property that they wanted. And you see both of these in Jefferson's first line, when the time has come, now when the time in human history has come that one people dissolve its units to another. So what then does the popular US historical narrative of a natural westward movement persist? The answer is that those who still hold the narrative remain captives to the ideology of manifest destiny, according to which the United States expands across the continent to assume a preordained size and shape. I call it faux religious, I call it justification, I call it after the fact, This ideology normalizes the successive invasions and occupations of indigenous nations and Mexico as not being colonialist or imperialist, but simply ordained progress. And you can see the map over here. This was once Spain. This was once Spain up here. All this was ceded to Britain in the Paris of 1863, Paris, end of the Treaty of Paris, 1763. All this Louisiana Purchase. When the Haitian Revolution in 1794 through 1801, that so frightened France. They said, you know what, we're going to simply get rid of this particular property. And they offered the whole thing to Jefferson, who actually had only wanted a little small piece of this. Tejana, the Mexican gift here, and then the cession. The Northwest Territory, which is still a land who is fiercely maintaining its white sovereignty. Most Europeans and North Americans learn their first history lessons through media. We know who these people are. There's always the faithful adjunct that have not been subject to the standards set by peer reviews or university presses or doctoral committees. From the 50s to the late 60s, Americans learned more about the history of colonial America and the American West from movies and television, the Wild West. You remember even George Bush in 2001 and those terrible events, who would talk about circle the wagons and bring them home living or dead, alive or dead. You see this kind of language that we were taking from John Wayne and even Ronald Reagan films. Before and after Hollywood's long commitment to the history of cowboys and pioneers, comic book rather than textbooks, country songs or rather than chronological tables filled the gaps left by the Westerns. Buffalo Bill, who was once a soldier and was once a military, once helped clean, who once enforced the federal policy, finally ends up being a carny, putting on a show. Then as now, American children, quite a few young males, learn to thematize parts of that history by playing cowboys and Indians. Dr. King's comment on genocide, which I'm going to quote here later, he ends it by talking specifically to this point that not only do we pay no attention to the genocide, our literature and our history have turned it into entertainment. So narratives of our past conform to our present, How I Met Your Mother, How I Met Your Father, all the ways that we reinvent our past to be at peace with places that we find ourselves. And one of the ways a settler colonial state manages this covering is through the circulation of its creation story. And you can think of the countries in Africa who largely in 15 years from 1885 to 2000, 1900, basically ended up conquering much of the African countries, quote, to help save them from enslavement. That's an odd way of putting it. These stories involve sign-turning mythologies that conceal the teleology of violence and domination that characterizes the settlement. That's a quote. So the West was racially homogeneous and romantically empty. Again, back to my initial question in American Studies class, I tell students to go to the American Wing and the National Gallery of Art. Look at the images. What's the country for? What are the animals for? What are the Indians for? What functions do they play? There was save a few noble and savage Indians. In this way, white supremacy takes the form of preservation of a space that was conducive to the ideals of a certain kind of Anglo-American whiteness, again, a term that would not have at that particular point been used, against the forces of corrupting influence of immigrants. It also serves to bolster Native American persons posed no serious threat to white society due to their supposed weakness and infantile minds. So the anti-modern West, complete with a non-modern Native people, serves to facilitate this, so that once they were no threat to society, but now they are vicious savages. There really was never a Western frontier. For the Europeans, enslavement was part of a larger strategy to depopulate the land to make way for European settlers. You pause and you think about it. They never say that in the history books. As early as 1636, after the Pequot War, in which the Pequot land was decimated and burnt by colonialists in Massachusetts, in which 300 indigenes were massacred. Those who remained were sold to enslavement and sent to Bermuda. Many of the indigenous survivors of King Philip's War, 1775, were enslaved. When going back to the massacre of the 300 Pequots, as an American study PhD from a fairly prestigious university, I have my share of American studies books in my particular head. And anyone studying New England Puritans, for example, are given Plymouth Plantation by William Bradford, which is kind of this encomium and how we managed and what it was like in those early days. One of the chapters, one of the pages in the book in which that is not quoted is Bradford's comment about how he watched them go into the town, massacre, set afire, stab, and burn, and the screams were hellish. So you don't, that particular thing, you don't have particularly get. The Pequots and the Narragansett, those who remained, were sent to the Barbados as enslaved persons. You know the story of the Salem witch hunt. You probably don't know that Tituba, the one who called out on the witches, was herself an enslaved Jamaican who had been brought into the village by the Puritan Reverend Samuel Parris, who owned her and who bought her. This is the kind of thing that one doesn't see in the narrative. Ethnic cleansing and the Indian, the crime that should haunt America. More recently, Jeffrey Osler, Surviving Genocide. Professor Osler spent the better part of 3 decades researching and teaching legacies of the American frontier. His conclusion, the wars the US government waged against Native Americans from 1600s to the 1900s differ in a fundamental way from the country's other contemporaneous conflicts. Against native lands and communities, it was genocidal war. Again, back to a PhD, back to the language, back to the books that one read, back to what one had to say about it, sitting in a class discussing the greatness of James Fenimore Cooper, Last of the Mohicans. And you can see it again in the images. You can see it in of the way the nature itself is empty, except for the persons on the outside who will then be coming in to replace it. So Cooper devises a fictional counterpoint of celebration to the dark underbelly of the new American nation, the birth of something new and wondrous, the US American race. A new people born of the merger of the best of both worlds. Kreb Kurz, Letters from an American Farmer. Who is this new American? This new American is German, is Irish, he doesn't say Irish, is English. And this is in 1803. It doesn't talk at all about the Black enslaved person, who by this time were 2nd and 3rd and 4th generation American. So in the novel, Cooper has the last of the noble and pure natives simply die off as nature intended, like some animal creeps off into the corner and dies. The last Mohican handing the continent over to Hawkeye, the nativized settler, his adopted son. The convenient fantasy could be seen as quaint if it were not for his deadly staying power. On the other coast, Los Angeles' 1850 slave market for indigenous is now the site of a federal courthouse. Slave market, not for Black Americans, but for the indigenous in California. The Laramie Treaty of 1851, the Severability Act, bills for the Senate of Congress, Indian Expropriation Land, Indian Citizenship Act, the Bureau of Indian Affairs. We have a lot of energy with what to do with these particular people. The Carlisle Indian School, and you've been seeing commentary. If you go down, for example, to Phoenix, you'll see the Indian School and the theory that if you can't take the Indian out of the country, you'll take the Indian out of the man. That was a quote from Mr. Carlisle. And there has been a number of stories uncovering the mass graves in, I'll say it, Indian schools north of us. What are Indians for? And a similar sort of text like this can be found if one is thinking about enslavement. You can think about, say, popular culture, Westworld, for example, or Battlestar Galactica, or the different ways in which we play out master and domination and captivity. Okay, a very famous kind of Puritan text, which is taught, and I taught it at Georgetown University. And it's always kind of one of these texts of how the native colonialists managed to make their particular way. What's interesting in these particular narratives, the narrative of the captivity and restoration of Mrs. Mary Rowlandson had to be authorized by a male. And of course, that when she comes back, when she is rescued, she's quote used goods. In other words, she's gone native. What do you do with it? So that image of going native, and you can go all the way forward to Apocalypse Now. That the fantasy and the eroticism of the native, my captivity among the Sioux Indians, the Indian captive, the narrative of Mrs. Jane Lewis, this particular image here. And how many of the particular images that you are seeing here, some of which we're going to look at now, are images in the National Gallery. This is how we remember our past. The racializing of this is not lost on any particular way, and the sexualization of it, if I can say that. 1893, 3 years after the atrocity at Wounded Knee, and the 500th year, the Columbiad after Columbus in the Caribbean. Frederick Jackson Turner, a very young assistant professor, writes The Significance of the Frontier in American History. The murder of Sitting Bull. Sitting Bull was being held by reservation police and was killed by the police. This is 1891. The superintendent of the census announced that the Western frontier was closed. Jackson Turner, historian, advanced the thesis that the conquest of the Western frontier had given American society its special character. Again, I have sat in any number of particular classes which we discussed for Frederick Jackson Turner and the closing of the American frontier. We never took the angle that I'm talking about here. A quote that I use on de Tocqueville that you never see in Democracy in America. Can it be that the colonialist, the European colonialist, is to the Black man as we are to the animals? We kill them until they come to do our will. Again, that's a quote that you'll not get from in class. At the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, marking the 400th anniversary of Columbus, Turner argued that the conquest of the West as the nation's formative experience, which had shaped the nation's character and values. He probably was not intending any irony, but I think I agree with him. Western expansion accounted for Americans' optimism, their rugged independence, their stress and adaptability, ingenuity, and self-reliance. Go figure. And what kind of culture does something like this appear? So what are Indians for? To finish with the question that I asked, an American elegy. All three of these particular images are famous pieces in the National Gallery. If you looked at any one of these, what are Indians for? What's the country for? You can see over here, the dark to light. What's coming behind? Delaware leader. They do what they please. They enslave those who are not their color. This is 1781, although created by the same great spirit who created us. They would make slaves of us if they could, but they cannot do it. They kill us. And his point here is that they cannot make slaves of us because they have accorded us a kind of agency. Eventually, that slides away too. There is no faith to be placed in the words. And as much as I respect, say, Abraham Lincoln for the way he learned about enslavement, and he was a man of a particular time, and he called Black leaders in 1861 and says, I have a plan to basically colonize, to free and colonize enslaved persons in a land called Lincolnia, which is present-day Colombia. And they looked at him and said, but we live here. This is our home. How can you send us to another home? John Wayne. I don't feel we did wrong in taking this great country away from them. There were great numbers of people who needed new land, and the Indians were selfishly trying to keep it to themselves. He's borrowing there from Theodore Roosevelt, by the way, if you want to see that. Doesn't take you much to tell you where the position of the subaltern is. Classic American Western novel. Maybe we want to see here. What do you see here? More compliance. Who pays these persons to dance around this? A Lakota helicopter. What priest would bless it? Within days of the assassination of Osama bin Laden, 2011, it was revealed by the Navy SEAL team executing the mission, they had used the code Geronimo for its target. Different text. As an incentive to recruit fighters, colonial authorities introduced a program of scalp hunting that became a permanent and long-lasting element of settler warfare against indigenous people. So when Jefferson's comment in the Declaration of Independence, and you can look it up, it's easy to find, that these persons did all kinds of terrible, horrible things to all kinds of people. This was particularly, at first, a colonial enterprise. Lord Amherst, who gives us Amherst College, quote, "Could it not be contrived to send the smallpox among the disaffected tribes of Indians? We must on this occasion use every stratagem in our power to reduce them." In current usage, the term Indian country is used by, quote, soldiers, military strategists, reporters, and World Wide Web users to refer to hostile, unsecured, and dangerous territory in Iraq and Afghanistan. Indian country is the military term for behind enemy lines, and it is still the case. I'm speaking from Washington, D.C., where some may know the history of a football team and why a name was changed. Education starts slowly, but we do what we can. 1609, Chief Powhatan to John Smith in the story of Jamestown, which of course has been whiteified quite a bit. Powhatan, who's killed by John Smith's brother the next year, he says this, "I'm now grown old and must soon die, and the succession must descend in order to my brothers, my 2 sisters, and their 2 daughters. I wish their experience were equal to mine, and that your love to us might not be less than ours to you. Why should you take by force that from us, which you could have by love?" This is in 1609. "Why should you destroy us who have provided you with food? Where do we think we get our fictionalized on Thanksgiving? What can you get by war? We can hide our provisions and fly into the woods, and then you must consequently famish by wrongdoing your friends." I'm going to end with Martin Luther King. "Our nation was born in genocide when it embraced the doctrine that the original American and the Indian was an inferior race. Even before there were large numbers of Negroes on our shores, the scar of racial hatred had already disfigured colonial society. From the 16th century forward, blood flowed in battles of racial supremacy. We are perhaps the only nation which tried as a matter of national policy to wipe out its indigenous population. Moreover, we elevated that tragic experience into a noble crusade. Indeed, even today, we've not permitted ourselves to reject or feel remorse for this shameful episode. Our literature, our films, our drama, our folklore all exalted. The images of Dr. King in 1963, Why We Can't Wait, is the name of the book. Robert, I'm all yours. I want to thank everyone for being part of not a particularly pleasant exploration of history, but thank you.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you, Edward. Greatly appreciate that. If anyone has any questions for Edward, feel free to type those in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll do our best to answer as many of those as possible. If you are watching live, I post the links to Edward's previous programs in the chat. So you can be on the lookout for that. Let's see, a few questions came up earlier. So Edward, what about, you talked before about PhD programs and reference the William Bradford book. What kind of is academia kind of at the forefront of changing the perceptions on this topic, or are they kind of going at the same pace as everyone else, or are they behind? Like where's the thought change on this being driven from? Is it a particular area or areas, or
To
are
use
some
the
doing better than
expression,
others?
I don't want to call it a guerrilla warfare, but it's individual professors. It's no accident that, for example, that if anyone with a college degree has essentially a college degree that was designed in Europe, your introduction to ethics, for example, your class is 101, European continental tradition. So many of our classes, including why we take Shakespeare in our schools, because our curriculum was designed in London and Britain. And I have said, and I say it to different colleges, to keep the statues if you want, put them in places of museum, but change the curriculum. And we changed the curriculum here. And did a presentation for you a couple of weeks ago about Martin Luther King and Henry David Thoreau. And we forever talk about Henry David Thoreau at Walden Pond, and he went to prison for taxes and spent a night in jail. We don't ever talk about his wild abolitionism. We don't ever talk about his book, Slavery in Massachusetts. That never comes up. So the work, Robert, and I think I want to credit Robert and DC Culture and History for making the change here, not only in this particular place, but wherever you are, you have hearing that this is where we are talking to some future professors, some people who are professors and lawyers and other particular persons. And it's the access to the narratives that are important. That
Okay.
Once people see that there are other narratives out there, the change will begin to happen.
Okay. And then this was a question from earlier. This is, are there any good reference materials that you know of on the impact of colonization on Native people's original diets?
There are actually. There's a book. In fact, I can't pull it up right now, but I'll try and find it on the colony, on the southwestern colonies. These tend to be kind of celebratory. Oh, the Gullah people eat this, and so on. This is what we have now in New Mexico, and we have a different kind of way of thinking of the same kind of food. So they tend to divorce. But the Columbian exchange, which is something again that we don't ever talk about much, when the complete devastation of persons and places, and what happened when you started bringing back and forth diseases and different kinds of crops. Yes, we got potatoes out of it, but what else did we get out of it?
Okay. And then we got a couple requests. If you could put the slide back up that has the pictures of the books.
Which ones? There were lots of
Oh,
them.
there was one from like 5 minutes ago, I think, or maybe 10 minutes ago.
Back up here. This one? No.
No, it was a few before that.
The more, yeah, these?
Yeah. Yes.
Again, Robert, again, as I said, I will always be available. I can give you a list of references. And I want to thank.
Oh, yeah, that would be great.
Thank the divine for the internet, because one can find all kinds of material like this. One can start someplace with the Britannica. I like Britannica, for example, as an encyclopedia, because it's one of the UK people, and it's the one that it's pretty critical on the UK's own involvement in what I would call the European blood empire.
And then also, question from earlier, what was going on back in Europe while all these events were taking place, as far as the subjugation of the First Peoples? Was that, I mean, obviously the news media was a lot different back 500 years ago or whatever, but was there any kind of thought back in, say, Spain of what was taking place, or it was too far away and they didn't worry about it?
That's kind of what I'm thinking about. Spain was doing all of this. I mean, this is one of the reasons I was posing what was happening on the East Coast with the Revolutionary War, with 1769. In other words, Spain's leaving the East Coast, which then enables the colonists to begin to think about their own particular land, the movement towards manifest destiny. What you have in you have France and England and Spain, who spend 100 years warring back and forth. So they're not paying a lot of attention to the politics over this. You will find English writers who will condemn, for example, the British colonists, and basically said, why is it that the loudest people who cry for freedom are the people who are the drivers of the Negroes? That's Samuel Johnson's quote.
Mm-hmm. What about currently over in Europe? Like, I guess an example, an American example would be people, for a long time, Andrew Jackson was considered one of our best presidents, but in the past, say, I don't know, 10 or 20 years, people have really kind of reevaluated his role in American history, and his kind of stature, so to speak, has really declined. Is it anything similar like that happening to people, historical figures in Europe? And I mean, I know there's like they tore down the statue in
Yes,
London of
Colton, for
the
example.
slave trader guy. But what about like in Spain? Do you know of any kind of reevaluations in places like that, or Portugal?
Mostly Britain, because Spain had a very different relationship to this. The British do not have in any kind of way, any kind of legal or common law background in what we would call enslavement. Portugal and Spain have a very different notion to it. Eugene Colton, and most of the British philanthropists from Bristol and Liverpool, these were persons who gave them the country that they have now. And when Prince Harry says last year, the UK has to come to terms with the shadows of its colonialism, he's one of the first people to do that.
Yeah, like another a good example is like Columbus. For the longest time we had Columbus Day, and they put statues up of him and cities named after him. And then again, in the past recent memory, have been kind of a reevaluation of him. But I don't know anything about like his
the interesting thing is that because
ranking in like say Europe, like do they? I guess what my question is, do they still think highly of Columbus in Europe, or not so much?
Not so much. I mean, they never did. We think highly of him here because the Italians were not white. They were not considered white. In the immigration wars of the 1880s, these were the persons who were the swarthier persons whom they did not want to have any particular part of, the mafia and the swarthy. And so Columbus Day was a way of establishing the fact that Columbus was an Italian, and so that therefore the Italians could be recuperated. So. And so I'm collapsizing 15 years here, but so that whole history of 1880 to 1893 and the Columbian exhibition was largely about retrieval and recuperation of Italians as persons deserving of a white country.
Okay, and then let's see. This was a question from earlier. What about the slave person Esteban de Dorantes of the Navarra's expedition 1536, first European in the Southwest United States? I'm not sure if you know anything about that particular topic. Does that ring a bell?
That's a particular. What's interesting. What's good here, and I thank the asker of the question, is the acknowledgement is that there was enslavement happening in this country before 1619. We tend to skew our history by thinking, oh, well, this all started in 1619. There's a whole 125 years history, including the persons, and I was serious earlier about, if you take a look at Belgium captivity and Belgium oppression in the Congo and look at the images there, and you'll see the same images that you see with Columbus and the Taino.
Okay, let's see, hold on, I'm looking through the questions. Edward, while I'm scrolling through the questions, would you mind telling folks some of the other programs you're going to be working on in the future? I know that you and I are still getting in sync as far as the dates and stuff go, but tell some folks, if you wouldn't mind, about some other things that we'll be putting on the calendar in the near future.
Well, the next three, as you know, coming up on the 26th, we have Dominion, What History Teaches, and I borrowed that word from de Tocqueville, and it's the second in my series of animal rights, and not animal rights, but thinking about animal and culture. And the first one was the sixth extinction in the Anthropocene. This one is looking at how Western culture, how we theorize and think about non-human animals. And the first week of March, every month, Robert helps me with a reparations call out, in which we look at a specific incident or incidences and persons. In November, in the first week of March, we're going to be looking at reparations number 5, which is Mexico, which again takes some of the material we're looking at here today and looks at how the persons, say, for example, the repatriation of Mexican citizens from California back to Mexico, and even though they were citizens, how one deals with that. Second week of second week of March, colonialism and white supremacy. and my basic point is it's like we throw rocks at all the time in the news. You see bad mothers, bad fathers who kill their children, or this terrible white supremacist is doing this, but we don't ever take a look at the structures in which these are established and made possible. We don't ever look at the legal around and the kind of requirements around marriage and the economies around that. We don't ever look at the systems, for example, that basically give permission to civil kinds of actions like this that are otherwise authorized in law or otherwise by someone who says something. These are my next three.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you. So we don't have those dates on our calendar just yet, but we'll be putting them on there in the near future, and happy to email those out to people that want to join us for that. Let's see, I think that does it for today. Edward, I want to thank you again so much for sharing your knowledge on this very important topic, a topic that people, I really feel, in my opinion, people don't really know a lot about the missions just in general, let alone the bad aspects of them. I grew up in Detroit, and in my opinion, the history of the US is really East Coast biased as far as the Mayflower and Plymouth Rock and all that kind of stuff. You really don't hear much, at least I didn't, in US history about anything going on in, like, say, California or Texas, with the exception maybe like the Alamo and the Gold Rush, and then things kind of pick up from there. So really appreciate you.
Our native indigenous tribes.
Yeah, there you don't hear much about just the history in general, let alone these kind of aspects of it. So really appreciate you enlightening us on some of these topics that we should know more about. You said that slavery, the slavery doesn't begin with in the the 1619 project, kind of same thing with just the history in general. It just doesn't, we tend to think of like US history of when it impacts the United States, like I said, the Alamo or the Gold Rush or something. There's so many things that took place before that we're not aware of. So greatly appreciate you enlightening us on some of these things.
Robert, I greatly appreciate DC Culture District making this a platform for education.
Oh yeah, no, we appreciate you. We had a big turnout today and a lot of questions. So again, I'll email out the dates for Edward's future programs. Appreciate everyone joining us and sharing in the discussion, and much more to come on these types of topics.
Assalamu alaikum, be at peace, be well and safe, everybody. Good night.
Excellent. Thanks, Edward. Take care. Appreciate it.
Bye.